All right, so welcome back to Bookkast. You know, the show where we try to bring you bestsellers in just minutes. And
That's right, Bestsellers in Minutes. And today we're diving into The Wager by David Grann.
Oh, this one's a good one, folks. The Wager, a tale of shipwreck, mutiny, and murder.
Buckle up. It's quite a ride. And, you know, I think one of the reasons you reached out to us is you're just looking for, like, the key takeaways, right?
Yeah, you're like, I've heard about this book. Everyone's talking about it. I see it on all the bestseller lists, but I don't really have time to dig into, a 500-page, deep dive into 18th century maritime history.
Right. You want the adventure, the drama, the human story, but, like, without maybe getting bogged down in all the, the minutia of naval regulations.
Exactly. And this is the perfect book for that because it really is like an adventure story, first and foremost.
Oh, absolutely. It reads like a thriller.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it makes you think, about the nature of truth, how stories get told and retold and whose voices get heard, especially in these extreme situations where survival is on the line.
Right. So we're going to unpack all of that for you today. We're going to set the scene, introduce you to the key players, and really dissect the events of this incredible true story.
And hopefully leave you with some lingering questions because The Wager, it really stays with you.
It does. So to set the stage, we're talking about 1739, right? The War of Jenkins Ear.
The War of Jenkins Ear. Yeah, it sounds a little ridiculous, right? Like a Monty Python sketch almost.
I know a war started over a severed ear, but there were some serious geopolitical tensions simmering beneath the surface.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just about one man's ear. This was about Britain wanting to break Spain's grip on the Americas and seize some of that sweet colonial wealth for themselves.
Right, and their prime target, the Holy Grail, so to speak, was the Manila Galleon.
The most desirable prize that was to be met with in any part of the globe, according to the book.
Wow, that's high praise. So what made this galleon so special?
Well, it was basically a treasure ship loaded with silks, spices, silver, porcelain, you name it all, coming from the Philippines back to Spain. And the British, they wanted a piece of that action.
So enter Commodore George Anson and his squadron of ships.
Dispatched in 1740, with orders to disrupt Spanish shipping and capture that elusive Manila Galleon.
And among Anson's fleet was the HMS Wager,
the ship that would become infamous for its disastrous journey and the subject to Grann's book.
Now, it's important to remember these ships were marvels of engineering, but they were also incredibly vulnerable, right?
Oh, absolutely. Buoyant wooden castles, as Grann calls them. But imagine, constantly exposed to the elements, saltwater sun wind.
Not to mention those pesky shipworms.
Teredo nivalis, the bane of every wooden ship, they just burrow into the hull and feast away.
And then you've got fungus-rot general decay. The average lifespan of a man-of-war back then was only about 14 years.
That's right, 14 years for these huge, expensive warships, and they were pushing their limits on these long voyages.
And this particular voyage, getting it off the ground, wasn't exactly a smooth operation either, was it?
No, not at all. Riddled with delays from the very start. And the crews they assembled, well, a lot of them were in pretty rough shape.
Like, these weren't exactly the cream of the crop of British sailors, were they?
Not quite. A lot of them were considered invalids, basically unfit for duty before they even set sail.
And then there's the ever-present threat of disease.
Right, especially typhus ship's fever. They called it incredibly contagious and deadly in those close quarters.
I mean, just think about it. Hundreds of men crammed together below deck, often in filthy conditions. It's a recipe for disaster.
The book mentions over 25 deaths on Anson's flagship, the Centurion, before they even left port.
Wow, that's just heartbreaking. So they're already facing an uphill battle before they even hit open water.
Exactly. And that's not even considering the psychological toll, right? The fear, the uncertainty of what lies ahead.
Okay, so let's talk about the captain of the Wager, a man named David Cheap.
Ambitious man David Cheap came from a good Scottish family, and he longed for glory, dreamed of commanding his own ship, of being a true lord of the sea.
But he hadn't really had his big break yet, had he?
No, not really. He'd spent years chasing pirates in the West Indies, but mostly just routine patrols, nothing too exciting or lucrative.
So this voyage to the Pacific, this was his chance to prove himself.
To make his mark, to capture some of that Spanish gold, and maybe even find a shortcut back to England through the fabled Northwest Passage.
So the stakes were high for Captain Cheap. And who else should we be paying attention to on board the Wager?
Well, there's John Byron, a young midshipman, only 16 years old, and as you might have guessed, the grandfather of the famous poet Lord Byron.
Oh, wow. So he's experiencing this brutal reality of naval life firsthand at a very young age.
And It was a stark contrast to his privileged upbringing, in Newstead Abbey.
And then there's John Bulkeley, the ship's gunner, right?
Yes, Bulkeley is a key figure because, unlike the officers who were required to keep official logs, Bulkeley kept his own detailed journals.
So we get his perspective on events, which sometimes differs quite a bit from the official accounts.
Oh, absolutely. His journals provide a fascinating and often contradictory view of what happened on the Wager, and they were crucial to Grann's research.
So we've got a captain eager for glory, a young aristocrat thrust into this harsh world, and a meticulous gunner documenting everything that's happening. It sounds like a recipe for some intense drama.
And that's before they even encounter the true perils of the voyage.
And those perils were significant right from the start.
Oh, yes. They faced delays leaving England, they battled storms in the Atlantic, and then the typhus epidemic really took hold.
It's hard to even imagine the conditions on board those ships during a typhus outbreak.
Hundreds of men packed together, the disease spreading rapidly. No real understanding of how to treat it. It was terrifying.
And then they had to round Cape Horn.
In March, the worst possible time.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't it safer to go east during the winter months?
It is, but their mission required them to go west, straight into the teeth of the prevailing westerly winds and those massive waves.
It's like they were deliberately sailing into the most dangerous waters on Earth.
Well, their orders were to attack Spanish shipping in the Pacific, so they had no choice but to brave Cape Horn.
And on top of the storms, they're also dealing with scurvy, right?
Oh, yes. A truly horrific disease caused by vitamin C deficiency.
I always forget how much of a problem scurvy was back then.
It was a major killer on long voyages. The symptoms were awful: weakness, fatigue, bleeding gums, swollen joints, and eventually death.
And they didn't even know what caused it.
No, they had no idea about vitamins or the importance of fresh fruits and vegetables. They thought it was caused by bad air or laziness.
It's amazing that anyone survived these voyages at all.
It is a testament to human resilience, but the death toll was staggering. Nearly 300 of the Centurion's 500 men died from scurvy alone.
So amidst all this death and chaos, the squadron starts to fall apart.
Yeah, the storms scatter the ships. The Severn and the Pearl disappear without a trace.
And there were rumors that they might have deserted, right?
Yeah, some people believe that the captains of those ships just couldn't face the horrors of Cape Horn and turned back.
And eventually the Wager itself gets separated from the rest of the fleet.
Lost and alone in those unforgiving waters.
And that's when the real trouble begins, right?
That's when the Wager runs aground on a desolate island off the coast of Patagonia.
And not just any island. This was the Golfo de Penas, which translates to...
That Gulf of Sorrows, very fitting.
It is. It really sets the scene for what's about to happen.
So imagine the scene: the Wager, battered by relentless storms they're trying to navigate, by dead reckoning, essentially guessing their position without accurate longitude readings.
Which was a huge problem back then, right?
Oh, yeah. Longitude was the great navigational challenge of the age. They couldn't pinpoint their location with any certainty.
So they're essentially sailing blind, and then boom, they hit the rocks.
A chaotic, terrifying scene, waves crashing over the deck, the rudder gone, the ship quickly filling with water. It's a miracle anyone survived the initial impact.
But survived they do, at least some of them.
140 men managed to scramble ashore onto this desolate rocky island, but their ordeal is far from over.
So now they're stranded, right? Freezing cold, damp, scarce food. What happens next?
Well, at first there's this burst of resourcefulness.
Yeah.
The instinct to survive kicks in.
Like what kind of things are they doing?
Well, Bulkeley the gunner, he proves to be quite the handyman. He manages to build a makeshift shelter using the ship's cutter.
Wow, that's impressive.
It is. They're scavenging for supplies, trying to make the best of a terrible situation. But as the days turn into weeks and no rescue appears, the situation starts to deteriorate.
The social order starts to break down.
Exactly. The established naval hierarchy, it just doesn't hold up in this kind of extreme environment.
Like they're no longer officers and crew, they're just desperate men fighting for survival.
And that's when the tensions really start to rise.
They also encounter the native people of the region, the Kawaskar, right?
They do, and this could have been a turning point for them. The Kawaskar were incredibly skilled at surviving in this harsh environment. They could have taught the castaways so much.
But it didn't go well, did it?
No, unfortunately, the castaways, driven by fear and desperation, they didn't treat the Kawaskar with the respect they deserved.
There were some clashes, some misunderstandings, and ultimately the Kawaskar withdrew.
Taking with them their invaluable knowledge of how to survive in this unforgiving place.
So the castaways are on their own, facing starvation, exposure, and infighting.
And Captain Cheap's leadership, it starts to unravel.
But he's not able to maintain control of the situation.
Exactly. He becomes increasingly isolated. He's seen as out of touch with the needs of the men.
And then there's this guy, James Mitchell.
Ah, yes. Mitchell, he emerges as a kind of rival leader, a more ruthless figure who appeals to the baser instincts of some of the men.
So it becomes us versus them.
Basically. And the fragile trust that held the group together completely evaporates.
And then there's the theft, right?
Oh, yes. The theft that becomes rampant, men stealing from each other, hoarding supplies. It's every man for himself.
So the situation is descending into chaos anarchy.
Exactly. And their only hope seems to be escaping this island, which leads them to this ambitious plan to build what they call the Ark.
The Ark? What is that?
Essentially, they salvaged what they could from the wreckage of the Wager, and they started rebuilding a longboat, a much smaller vessel, but hopefully seaworthy enough to get them off this island.
It sounds like a long shot.
It was a desperate gamble, but they didn't have many other options.
And this whole process of building the Ark, it just exacerbates the tensions within the group, right?
It does, because now they're not just fighting for survival, they're fighting for a place on this escape vessel.
And that's when the mutiny happens.
Yes, fueled by desperation and resentment. A group of men, led by Bulkeley the gunner, they decide they've had enough of Captain Cheap's leadership.
They see him as weak, indecisive, out of touch.
And they take matters into their own hands.
They mutiny.
They confine Cheap to his quarters, and they drop their own set of rules for the group that will attempt to sail away on the Ark.
And what about Cheap? What happens to him?
He refuses to leave. He says he'd rather be shot than carried off a prisoner.
So he stays behind on the island with a small group of loyalists,
And a very limited amount of supplies,
while the rest set sail in the Ark.
along with a smaller barge and a yawl, all dangerously overcrowded with dwindling provisions.
So now we've got two groups of survivors, each facing their own incredibly difficult journey.
And their stories diverge dramatically.
So what happens to Bulkeley and his group?
They attempt to sail through the treacherous Strait of Magellan, aiming for the Portuguese settlements in Brazil.
Which is no easy feat.
No, they face storms, starvation, continued descent within their ranks. It was an epic struggle for survival.
And what about Cheap and his men?
They attempt to round Cape Horn again in their much smaller and less seaworthy barge.
Which is even crazier than the first time.
It is. They face further shipwrecks, they're forced to turn back, and eventually they end up back on that same desolate island.
The Gulf of Sorrows living up to its name.
It is. And their ordeal continues for months before they're finally rescued by the Spanish.
So they end up as prisoners of war of the very empire they were sent to fight against.
It's a cruel twist of fate.
And what about Bulkeley and his group? Do they make it to Brazil?
They do. After months of hardship, they finally reach the Portuguese settlements, but their journey is far from over.
So they eventually make it back to England.
They do. In January 1743, Bulkeley and a companion named Cummins, they arrive in England, and their stories start to spread.
And then Cheap and Byron, they eventually make it back too.
Yes, but much later, after enduring even more hardships and facing accusations of their own.
So now you've got all these survivors back in England, each with their own version of events.
And their stories are wildly contradictory.
Accusations flying everywhere. Who's the hero? Who's the villain? Who's telling the truth?
It becomes a battle of narratives, a fight for reputation and vindication.
And Bulkeley, he publishes his own account, right?
He does A Voyage to the South Seas. It becomes a bestseller, and it really shapes public opinion.
So he's controlling the narrative to a certain extent.
He's presenting himself as the resourceful leader, the man who saved the men from Cheap's incompetence.
But Cheap and his loyalists, they have their own side of the story.
They do. They accuse Bulkeley of mutiny, of being a liar and a manipulator.
So who's telling the truth?
That's the question that David Grann grapples with in The Wager, and it's a question that ultimately has no easy answer.
Because the truth is often subjective, especially in these kinds of extreme situations.
Exactly. Trauma, memory, perception. They all play a role in how we remember and recount events.
And the Admiralty, they're trying to make sense of all this, right?
They launch an investigation, they convene a court-martial to try to determine what really happened on the Wager.
And what's the verdict?
Well, surprisingly, no one is convicted of mutiny or murder.
Really, so despite all the accusations, all the drama, no one is held accountable.
It seems that the Admiralty was more concerned with maintaining order and discipline within the Navy than with punishing individuals.
Like they wanted to send a message that mutiny wouldn't be tolerated.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they also recognized the extraordinary circumstances of the Wager's voyage.
And the fact that the truth was so elusive.
So the Wager, it becomes this cautionary tale, a reminder of the fragility of human nature and the perils of ambition.
And the power of storytelling, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it's the stories we tell ourselves and others that shape our understanding of the past.
So The Wager is much more than just a shipwreck story. It's a story about survival, betrayal, the limits of human endurance, and the enduring power of narrative.
And it's a story that continues to resonate with readers centuries later.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the choices we make under pressure and how our perspectives shape our understanding of the world.
And it reminds us that history is never simple. It's always messy and complex and full of contradictions.
Absolutely. So if you're looking for a thrilling and thought-provoking read, The Wager by David Grann is definitely worth checking out.
And if you want to explore the story further, Grann includes extensive notes and sources in the back of the book.
So you can really dive deep into the historical context and the different perspectives on this incredible true story.
And maybe even come to your own conclusions about what really happened on The Wager.
Thanks for joining us on Bookkast, where we bring you bestsellers in minutes. Tune in next time for another deep dive into a captivating book.
We'll see you then.
Bye.